A unanimous decision from the Supreme Court has just reshaped what can happen the next time flashing lights appear in your rearview mirror. And right now, almost no one is talking about it. 9 justices, zero disagreement, drawing a line that directly impacts every driver who legally carries a firearm in their vehicle. And here's the part that should make you pause. Most people won't hear about this ruling until it actually affects them, until they're already pulled over, until an officer is standing at their window, until a routine traffic stop starts moving in a direction they didn't expect. Because in that moment, there's a split-second decision that can determine everything, whether your rights actually protect you or whether they quietly slip away. And what makes this even more critical is how misleading this ruling can be if you only understand part of it. On the surface, it sounds like a major win, and in many ways it is. But beneath that headline is a set of conditions, limits, and pressure points that can completely change the outcome if you don't understand how it works in real situations. There are moments during a stop where this decision can work in your favor immediately. And there are moments where a single sentence, one action, or one wrong assumption can make it irrelevant. So, before you ever find yourself on the side of the road trying to figure it out in real time, you need to understand exactly what changed, and just as importantly, what didn't. Hi, I'm Timothy, and I break down major legal developments like this in a way that actually prepares you for what happens outside the courtroom, where these rulings either protect you or fail to do so. Because what just came out of the Supreme Court is not just another headline. It directly affects how law enforcement can interact with you the moment a firearm becomes part of a traffic stop. In the next few minutes, I'll walk you through exactly what the court decided, why all 9 justices agreed, something that rarely happens in cases like this, and the key details most people will overlook that could create serious consequences in the wrong situation. I'll also show you the exact moments during a stop where this ruling works in your favor, and the situations where it does not apply at all. And there are 3 specific pressure points built into this that you need to understand clearly because they are the exact places where things tend to go wrong for people who believe they're protected when they're not. To understand why this ruling matters as much as it does, you have to look at the tension that has been building for years beneath something as routine as a traffic stop. On paper, your rights are straightforward. The Second Amendment protects your right to keep and bear arms. That is clearly established. And for millions of Americans, it's something they exercise legally and responsibly every day. At the same time, the Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. That means the government cannot search your vehicle, your belongings, or your property without a warrant or a specific legal justification known as probable cause. 2 fundamental rights, both essential, both intended to coexist. But on the road, these 2 rights began to collide in a way that created a real legal issue. Because the question that kept appearing in courts across the country was this: the moment an officer becomes aware that there is a firearm inside your vehicle during a traffic stop, what does that allow them to do next? Does that information alone give them authority to search your car, even if you've done nothing wrong? Even if the firearm is completely legal and there are no signs of criminal activity? That question may sound simple, but the answers from different courts were anything but consistent. And that inconsistency created a serious problem for lawful gun owners. Some lower courts started to adopt a line of reasoning that treated the presence of a firearm as inherently suspicious. The logic followed that firearms are dangerous by nature, so their presence creates risk, and that risk justifies broader authority for officers to ensure safety, including searching the vehicle. At first glance, that may seem like a precaution, but in practice, it led to something far more significant. It turned lawful behavior into a basis for intrusion. It meant that simply exercising your Second Amendment rights could be used to weaken your Fourth Amendment protections. Consider what that looks like in reality. You're following the law, you're carrying legally, you're not suspected of any crime. Yet the mere presence of a firearm becomes a reason to search your vehicle. No warrant, no additional evidence, no clear indication of wrongdoing, just the firearm. And once that logic is accepted, you are no longer operating under 2 separate protections. You are effectively being forced to choose between them. Carry your firearm or maintain your privacy, but not both. That is not how constitutional rights are meant to function. They are designed to exist together, not cancel each other out. This issue wasn't just theoretical, it was happening in real traffic stops, affecting real people. More cases began to follow this pattern, more rulings supported it, and more situations emerged where lawful gun owners were treated as if they had crossed a legal boundary simply because of what they had in their vehicle. As this trend continued, it started to influence behavior on the ground. Officers no longer needed to explain much beyond the presence of a firearm, and courts increasingly accepted that as sufficient. For the average person, this created uncertainty. The rules weren't just unclear, they were shifting. Because if the standard becomes gun equals search, then every traffic stop involving a lawful firearm carries a built-in risk that has nothing to do with actual wrongdoing. That is the environment this case came from. Not a single incident, but a growing pattern that blurred a constitutional boundary that should have remained clear. The case that ultimately reached the Supreme Court didn't begin with anything dramatic. No high-speed pursuit, no major investigation. It started with a routine traffic stop, the kind that happens every day. A minor violation, something small, the kind of interaction that should end quickly with a warning or a citation. The officer approaches, the conversation begins normally, and the driver is calm, cooperative, and not giving any reason to escalate the situation. At some point, it becomes known that there is a firearm in the vehicle. The driver doesn't hide it or act suspiciously. It is disclosed or visible. There is no sign of illegal activity. This is a law-abiding citizen exercising a legal right. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The officer decides that the presence of the firearm is enough to go further, enough to justify searching the vehicle. No warrant, no additional facts, no clear evidence of a crime. Just the firearm. The driver objects and does not give consent, believing his rights protect him. But the search happens anyway. As the case moves through the legal system, the lower courts uphold the search. They accept the argument that the presence of a firearm alone created a sufficient safety concern. In other words, they supported the idea that lawful gun ownership could be treated as suspicious. That is the point where this issue became too significant to ignore. Because if that reasoning stands, it doesn't just affect one person. It changes the rules for millions. When the case reached the Supreme Court, something unusual happened. All 9 justices, despite different legal perspectives, reached the same conclusion. A unanimous decision. No disagreement, no divided opinions. That alone signals how clearly the court viewed this issue. And the core of their decision is straightforward. The presence of a legally possessed firearm in a vehicle by itself does not establish probable cause to search that vehicle. Not sometimes, not depending on circumstances. By itself, it does not. In practical terms, this means lawful firearm possession is not suspicious behavior. Carrying legally is not evidence of a crime, and it cannot be treated that way. The court made it clear that exercising one constitutional right cannot be used as a reason to weaken another. The Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment are not in conflict. They operate together. And when the court speaks this clearly, it sends a message nationwide. This is no longer a gray area. The boundary is defined. But before assuming this ruling solves everything, it's important to understand where many people misunderstand it. The key part of this decision comes down to 2 words: by itself. The court did not say a firearm can never contribute to probable cause. It said it cannot be the only reason. And that distinction changes everything. The moment any additional factor is introduced, anything an officer can point to or interpret, the legal analysis shifts. What feels like strong protection can narrow quickly. This is where many people get caught off guard. They hear about a unanimous decision and assume they are fully protected, but this ruling is not a shield against every situation. It is a boundary. And boundaries only work when you know exactly where they begin and end. The first major limitation is who this ruling protects. It applies to lawful gun owners. That word, lawful, is critical. If you are legally allowed to possess a firearm, the ruling supports you. But if there is any issue with your legal status, the situation changes immediately. If someone is prohibited from possessing a firearm for any reason, the presence of that firearm is no longer neutral. It becomes potential evidence of a crime. And at that point, this ruling does not apply in the same way. Even for lawful owners, there is another layer that often gets overlooked. Legality is not just about possession, it's about compliance with how the firearm is carried and stored. Each state has its own specific requirements. Some require the firearm to be unloaded, others require it to be secured in a certain way, and some regulate how accessible it can be inside the vehicle. These details matter more than most people realize, because if a firearm is handled in a way that violates state law, even unintentionally, that changes the entire situation. What was neutral becomes a potential violation, and the legal protection from this ruling no longer applies in the same way. Then there is the third major factor, what's known as the totality of the circumstances. This is where the firearm becomes part of a broader picture. Even though it cannot justify a search on its own, it can be considered alongside other factors. For example, behavior that appears unusual, conflicting statements, or other observations can be combined to form a justification. The ruling did not remove this type of analysis. It only removed the ability to rely on the firearm alone. And in real situations, decisions are rarely based on one detail. They are based on everything happening at that moment. This leads to the most critical moment during a traffic stop, the request for consent. When an officer asks if they can search your vehicle, it may sound routine, but it carries significant consequences. If you agree, the protections provided by this ruling no longer apply in the same way because you have given permission. That changes the legal foundation of the search entirely. Understanding how to handle a stop becomes essential. Staying calm, keeping movements controlled, communicating clearly, and avoiding unnecessary statements all play a role. If you choose not to answer certain questions or not to consent to a search, it should be done respectfully and without escalation. The goal is not to argue on the roadside, but to maintain your legal position. At the same time, it's important to recognize that officers still have authority related to safety during a stop. They can take reasonable steps to manage the situation. However, this ruling makes it clear that those steps cannot automatically extend into a full search without proper justification. That distinction is where this decision has real impact in everyday situations. If a search still occurs after consent is refused, the most important thing is to remain composed and not escalate the situation. Clearly stating that you do not consent while remaining cooperative helps preserve your position. What happens afterward can be evaluated through the proper legal process. There is also an important factor to consider when traveling. While this ruling applies broadly to constitutional protections, firearm laws themselves vary from state to state. Crossing state lines can introduce different requirements, and what is legal in one place may not be in another. Understanding those differences ahead of time is essential because the protection of this ruling depends on lawful possession within the specific jurisdiction. When everything is considered, this decision represents a significant clarification of constitutional boundaries. It reinforces that lawful firearm possession alone does not justify a search, but it also makes clear that these protections depend on how they are applied in real situations. They require awareness, understanding, and careful handling in the moment. Most people will only learn about this after something goes wrong, but if you understand it beforehand, you approach that moment differently. You recognize the boundaries, you know how to respond, and you avoid the mistakes that can change the outcome. Because in the end, this ruling provides a clear line, but staying on the right side of that line depends on how well you understand it and how you act when it matters most.